Welcome to Whack-a-Doodle, where we'll be discussing a series of court cases with potential schemes, slurs, sexism, Schrodinger's employee, sleeping on park benches, and some real strange stuff, guys. Alright, to start us off, let's talk about this recent case. And it's called Duzic versus Dragon Curve Financial Capital. On the surface, it seems like a simple case with a simple solution. The plaintiff, Ryan Duzic, said he was hired in 2019 to work for Dragon Curve Financial Capital, and I'm just going to call it Dragon Curve from here on out. He says he was never paid, and then he was fired when he complained about the lack of salary, which falls under retaliation, which is illegal in New York. The defendant is the company Dragon Curve, and they allege that Ryan Duzic never worked for Dragon Curve, and they say that he quit, and therefore he was not fired. Does this sound strange, complicated, and somewhat fishy to you? Well, that's just the tip of the iceberg. So the characters at play are Ryan Duzic. He is the plaintiff. He's the one that brought the case to the court. The next character is David Duzic, who is the plaintiff's father, but he was brought into the case due to the allegations that he made a deal with the owners of Dragon Curve to get his son a job in exchange for helping to get investors for Dragon Curve. He is reportedly very rich, a millionaire, and has a 16,000 square foot mansion in Tennessee. He is also referred to as he who must not be named. Yes, really. Next we have Ethan Eden, who is the co-owner of Dragon Curve, probably, and multiple other fintech companies. He gave a deposition about meeting David Duzic and hiring his son, Ryan Duzic. Next we have Michelle Page, who is also a co-owner of Dragon Curve, probably. She's a Harvard business grad, a Yale Law School grad, and a former hedge fund manager, and she's the CEO, CFO of fintech companies. Next, Christopher Page, the lawyer for the defense during the trial, and husband of Michelle Page. He is also the lawyer for Dragon Curve, and this is somehow not a problem or a conflict of interest. As for companies, we'll just start off with the main two, Dragon Curve Financial Capital, or Dragon Curve, and Digital Financial, or DiFi. They are both fintech companies. As a side note, even after all this research, I have no idea what fintech companies do. It's something about translating and compiling user data or customer data. Are these the companies that NordVPN has warned us about? This isn't sponsored, by the way. I'm just asking. I don't know. It seems kind of fake to me, even outside of the context of this case, but I digress. The two companies, Dragon Curve and DiFi, have similar employees and similar owners, which are Ethan Eden and Michelle Page. The testimony was conflicting about how these two companies fit together. At this point, I'm not sure anybody really knows. So thanks for bearing with me with all this. Let's get into the story. Chapter 1. The Contract. So when I presented the basics of this case, you may have thought, how complicated could this be? Just look at what the contract said. That's what I thought as well, and oh, how naive I was. There was no real contract. There was barely any official paperwork at all in evidence. But this isn't the end of the plaintiff's case, as verbal contracts can be valid in court. I didn't know about this before, but it is true, so the case will continue on. So the closest thing to a contract that we have is an email and what looks like an offer letter. It's to Ryan Duzic from Ethan Eden, and it is on Dragon Curve letterhead. It confirms Ryan Duzic's employment at Dragon Curve as VP of Corporate Development and External Communications, and the salary is $130,000. It says it's payable in accordance with Dragon Curve's ordinary payroll practices. Spoiler alert, there is no paperwork about their payroll practices. This letter was signed by Ethan Eden, and he has the title CEO of Dragon Curve Financial Capital, Inc. So let's pause for a second and decode this. This is not a contract by any means. Duzic did not sign it, but it does give the company, title, salary, and it is from Dragon Curve. The title and the salary seem suspicious. This is someone who's just a little bit out of college. He has no real experience in fintech, And he's earning $130,000 in a VP title? Really? To explain that, all of the parties admitted, and there is text message evidence to show, that the offer letter was only for proof of employment, so that Ryan Duzik could send it to a landlord and get an apartment in New York City so that he could start working at the company. According to Eden, the VP title was requested by Ryan Duzik's father. So, with the lack of any other real contract, this seems to be the only paperwork available. And this is the basis for the plaintiff's case. Lesson here: get a real contract before you start working anywhere. There was also a separate document, an email to which this offer letter was attached. It was from Eden using a DiFi email address, and it submits to glossing over details, quote unquote, which this seems to be a big part of the problem. Most importantly, it said that they plan to defer and accrue compensation pending the close of the King's acquisition, quote unquote. So this is the basis, or part of the basis, for the defense's argument, because the King's acquisition fell through during COVID. So just as a side note, the King's acquisition was Ethan, Eden, and Michelle Page attempting to purchase a third fintech company under Dragon Curve, or possibly as a separate company. The testimonies contradict each other once again, but just know that they were trying to buy this other third company and it did not work out. There was also an argument of whether pending meant if or when they acquired the company. And then finally, there was an argument if the offer letter was supposed to stand alone or if this contract with this pending language was actually part of it. So overall, it was unclear, which is a key theme for this case. And the last piece of paperwork evidence that also may or may not qualify as a contract was a health insurance form that Duzik filled out. And it gave him health insurance, but under DiFi, not under Dragon Curve. And he listed his DiFi email. In this paperwork, there was also a box checked that indicated he worked on the basis of commission, with an asterisk that referred to a commission plan. However, once again, the commission plan was not provided in evidence, and according to testimony, there was never a commission plan in place. So the defendant said that this form indicated that his contract was changed and that Duzik was actually an employee of DiFi, not Dragon Curve. And remember that only Dragon Curve is being sued right now. DiFi is not being sued in this case. The defendants also say that because Duzik never made a sale, he shouldn't be paid because this commission-only box was checked. However, by my own research, New York law clearly states that a commission plan must be in place. So one thing they did have as evidence, and there was a lot of it, was that Ryan Duzik did do work for one of their companies for almost a year, for either DiFi or Dragon Curve. There were plenty of text and emails available to show that. There was a dispute at the trial of whether he did work for Dragon Curve or whether he did work for DiFi, but even the owners didn't agree on how the two companies were divided and what each company did. So that, in my opinion, doesn't seem very relevant. If the owners don't even know what the two companies do, then how can anyone say if he did work for one company or another? So overall, it seems like Ryan Duzik was just very naive and perhaps too trusting. The Dragon Curve owners, on the other hand, seem incompetent at best. The lack of any kind of paperwork, including like a basic PowerPoint slide about what company owns the other, is mind-blowing to me. And also the fact that there's no contract on record when you allegedly hired this guy. It's strange. But at this point, the evidence does seem flimsy on both sides, with Dragon Curve clearly doing something strange in not having or not keeping track of a real contract and not having a commission plan. And both parties were in the wrong for sending an offer letter that no one intended to be factual and that was only created for lease agreement purposes. So the question remains, was Ryan Duzik an employee at Dragon Curve? At DiFi? At both? At neither? He was Schrodinger's employee at this point in the case. Interestingly, the only paper that included the name Dragon Curve was the offer letter and then the termination letter, which we'll get to later. In fact, I had trouble finding evidence that this company exists at all, even outside of this court case. But that's for a later chapter. Now we'll get into Chapter 2. Retaliation. So this is the next part of the case, and Ryan Duzik is alleging that he was fired for asking or complaining about his lack of compensation, which is definitely illegal in New York City. So let's see the evidence here. In June 2020, Michelle Page texted Duzik saying that, per their phone conversation, she hopes that he will reconsider, but is happy to give him a letter of recommendation. In a testimony, she said that prior to this text, Duzik called her to tell her that he was quitting, and therefore he was not fired in retaliation since he had already quit. There is no other paperwork confirming his resignation. There's no email, there's no HR letter, there's no exit interview, there's no per our previous conversation, there is just this text. Next, in July 2020, Duzik's attorney sent a notification of a lawsuit against Dragon Curve. Very soon after that, Duzik's email and computer access were cut off. We do have a text message proving this, with Duzik saying his email wasn't working and asking Michelle Page to dial him in to an upcoming work call since he didn't have access. So clearly, regardless of what happened on that phone call in June, he was still working up to the time when his email was shut off. So this was effectively firing him. And we do have a lot of evidence that Duzik was still working up until the time his email was shut off. And at the trial, when asked why he was still working after allegedly quitting, Michelle Page stated that she didn't know, that he just kept showing up. Which, okay, sure. For additional evidence, there was an email dated August 3rd, 2020, and it said that they are notifying him that his employment with DiFi ended on July 30th, 2020, and it gave him a link to some unemployment benefits. Finally, there was a letter sent to Duzik's attorney, not Duzik himself. It was from Michelle Page, and it's dated September 9th, 2020. And it says this is to, quote, formally notify you that any and all previous offers of employment with Dragon Curve Financial Capital Inc. and or with any of its affiliated entities is hereby withdrawn, unquote. So this is vague about resignation versus termination, but it is the most official termination letter that we have. Again, unclear what's going on and kind of sloppy at best. But this is where we're at with the accusations in this case. Chapter 3. Sexism. So believe it or not, allegations of sexism were also part of this case. The defense alleged that Duzik didn't understand the terms of his employment, not because it was unclear and there was no contract, but because it was explained to him by Michelle Page and not Ethan Eden. And Duzik was sexist and didn't accept Michelle Page's answers or explanations about his employment. So this is on the basis that during the deposition, Duzik said Michelle Page was, quote, a worker bee, unquote, and that he wanted Eden to explain his employment situation. Based on the evidence of the text message and email exchanges, Eden did punt him off to Michelle Page quite a lot, but Eden and Duzik's father kind of made the original deal. So in my personal opinion, this was maybe more of a nepotism thing than a sexist thing, but I don't know. That's just me. Also, there was conflicting testimony about who owned Dragon Curve and who kind of was the decision maker of Dragon Curve. So it may actually be that Duzik just thought Eden was the primary owner, regardless of gender. But based on the paperwork evidence, or lack thereof, I don't think this makes a real difference whether or not he was sexist. I mean, maybe he was, but there needed to be a written contract. Otherwise, they could say that they discussed anything. That his salary was $1 million, that Duzik had to pay Dragon Curve to work there, that he had to balance on a tightrope and juggle flaming bowling pins to get his salary. The lack of paperwork is really the biggest problem for me personally. One other point to make in this chapter, Michelle Page also testified that she personally was a big supporter of women and minorities. So let's just put a pin in that and we'll come back to it later. Chapter 4. Damages. Duzik was suing not just for his salary, but also for damages in this case, saying that he couldn't get another job after this and that he suffered from depression and mental health issues due to all these employment issues. And Duzik did have a gap in his resume after working at Dragon Curve. So Dusick also alleges that he was depressed, which I don't doubt, and that he saw a therapist a few times, which a few times is not a lot. He also said that he had to move back in with his father and live in his father's basement, and the defense argued that it's a pretty big basement, since he's rich and lives in a mansion. I'm kind of on the fence about those arguments, but there was something else that was actually provided by the defense that, to me, shows more emotional damages. So this was a text message exchange from Dusick to Eden, and this was in the height of COVID lockdown. And I'm going to paraphrase this. I went to Jersey for a date with a girl, and she ghosted me, and now I'm just lying on a random park bench in New Jersey. I don't even have money for an Uber home, and my dad isn't responding to give me money. And I don't know what to do anymore. Eden, seemingly uncomfortable, replied that he would send him money for an Uber home. To me, that is the lowest of low points in someone's life. Texting the CEO of your company for Uber money, and also probably a little bit of sympathy, while laying on a park bench in New Jersey after a failed date. That proves emotional damages more than 100 therapy appointments, to me personally. So this is the summary of the evidence, or at least what I felt was the important evidence. So now we get on to Chapter 5, the verdict. So here, in this case, the jury found that Dragon Curve was at fault, and they awarded Dusick the salary plus damages. But our story isn't over yet. Let's move on to Chapter 6, Post-Court Filings. So our story is far from over. Based on the filings, the defendant, through the lawyer Christopher Page, has continued filing letters/correspondence to the judge. My interpretation of these letters is that he's essentially saying that the company, Dragon Curve, has no money to pay the plaintiff. The plaintiff, through their witness testimony, agreed that the company has no money, and that also the court has agreed that Dragon Curve has no money. And they're saying this because before the trial, the defense changed their lawyer to be Christopher Page. And this was due to their lack of funds to support an outside lawyer. So they're basically saying the court agreed the company Dragon Curve has no money, or else they wouldn't have allowed Christopher Page to be their lawyer. So his conclusion then is that they must overturn the jury's verdict, which I don't completely understand, but also I don't have a law background. Maybe he's just saying in an official manner that the plaintiff needs to stop coming after them for money since they don't have any. But of note is the tone of these letters. And again, I am not a lawyer, but to me, this seems a little strange and unprofessional. I'll read directly from the letter here from Christopher Page, who is an experienced lawyer, to the judge. As a matter of law, this entire dispute is moot and thus should be dismissed. At best, the plaintiff worked for 11 months for an entity he knew to be broke. Therefore, he cannot complain when his efforts to draw blood from a stone fail, nor can this court be transformed into a debating society, litigating how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. Quite simply, the judgment doesn't matter because the plaintiff cannot recover from this defendant. This does not mean that plaintiffs can't sue paupers, but it does mean that where, as here, the court necessarily determined that the defendant is a pauper, the court cannot waste additional scarce judicial resources on issues devoid of practical utility. So if I'm interpreting this correctly, it seems like he's just kind of saying, you should give up because Dragon Curve has no money. He also says in this letter, quote, the jury's verdict cannot stand. This is kind of where he's losing me. I get that they can't pay, but the jury's verdict is the jury's verdict. Also, everything seems unnecessarily dramatic, but maybe that's just how lawyers are. I don't know. He also says in these letters, quote, neither law nor equity permit a recovery where, as here, one executive of a failed business, a vice president exclamation point, seeks to recover wages, in quotes, from the other executives of a failed business. That maxim's particularly true where, as here, the executive at issue was the executive in charge of raising capital, exclamation point. A lot of exclamation points here, which is interesting because I know it was kind of drilled into my head working in corporate, like, don't use too many exclamation points in emails. So like each one of them is like, whoa, this is crazy to me, but maybe it's different for lawyers. Also want to note an inconsistent use of M dashes. Like he uses like an N dash and a hyphen, which only stating that to say I don't think ChatGPT wrote this because it would have gotten the M dashes correct, I think. So let's keep going. He also acknowledged that, quote, this court did not permit responses to the post-trial memos, unquote. And then he proceeded to send a post-trial memo. And in this letter, he says, quote, again, that's brazenly and blatantly false. You made your own motion to disqualify me, and you ruled upon that motion. You literally directed us both to file memoranda on that motion, unquote. I'm not sure who the you is in this statement because it's a letter to the court. I would think that this is directed towards the judge, but holy moly, this seems like a rude way to talk to a judge, right? I don't know. Maybe it's directed towards the opposing counsel. Maybe I don't know what I'm talking about. He also says, I regret that I have been forced to take this action, which I assume refers to him submitting a response to the post-trial memo, which he says wasn't allowed. I think it sums up my feelings on this. Unnecessarily dramatic and strangely unprofessional. But again, I'm comparing this to my workings in corporate America. Perhaps law is different. Oh, but in his defense, he did sign it as respectfully submitted. So maybe that's fine. Maybe it's respectful. I don't know. But if you thought this was odd, there's more where that came from. Chapter 7. Professionalism. So once again, I'm not a lawyer, but some things just seem kind of odd to me in the pretrial memos and behavior during the testimony in court of the defense. So pretrial, there seemed to be a lot of requests for delays. That might have been obvious since the matter occurred in 2020 and the trial wasn't until 2025. But something that did stand out to me was the language in a pretrial memo where they're asking to dismiss the case. So from my reading, they're saying that the plaintiff contradicted themselves in their deposition. So that's the testimony they give before the trial. So therefore, the case should be dismissed. But the way they go about saying it, I don't know, it's strange to me. The letter says, quote, let's assume the mistake here was the court's, not the plaintiff's. Let's assume the court is, or might be, so lazy, stupid, or careless that we should infer that the court simply misunderstood the plaintiff's prior testimony, unquote. So my interpretation of this is, he's saying, if you don't agree with me, you're lazy, stupid, and or careless. And so, regardless of professionalism here, if you want someone to agree with you and you want someone to do what you ask them to do, is it a good idea to call them lazy, stupid, or careless? Oh, this is so weird to me. So let's skip forward a bit in the filings and keep going. Quote, this court, in all caps, made that argument either as a result of the plaintiff's deceptions or as a result of its own incompetence. Respectfully, I haven't seen any evidence of this court's incompetence, so I submit that we have, by process of elimination, proven this plaintiff's deception beyond any reasonable doubt, unquote. So, I mean, he did say that he has not seen evidence of incompetence by the court, and he also said respectfully, so maybe that's cool, maybe that's fine. So let's move on to the behavior in court during the testimony. Now let's remember here, both the pages have law degrees from very prestigious institutions. There was some question on whether they were practicing still or if they'd had their licenses renewed or whatever, but regardless, one would think that they have a general understanding of how the court system works. And even if they don't, Maybe because they practice a different type of law. Maybe it varies state by state and they're not familiar with like New York process. But still, one would think that they at least understood courtroom etiquette and that they at least understood it as much as I do, as just a general layperson that doesn't know anything. But let's just look at the examples and you can form your own opinions, which I always encourage. So throughout the trial, there was a general sense that the pages didn't understand court procedure. They were constantly asking questions to the judge about different motions and objections and paperwork. They were speaking over each other and the witnesses and the other lawyers and the judge. They had issues finding evidence, reading the evidence, seeing the evidence, understanding what they were supposed to do with the evidence. And they just seemed like, in general, they didn't know what they were doing or know what was going on. At one point, Christopher Page asked Michelle Page a question while she was giving her testimony, and she responded with, "Why are you asking me that?" Which, in any situation, you're not supposed to ask any questions back to the lawyer. You are the one that is answering the questions when you are on the witness stand. And you certainly wouldn't ask a lawyer why he was asking you a certain question. And you certainly wouldn't ask your own lawyer why he was asking you a question. And you also wouldn't ask your own lawyer, who is also your husband, who you presumably have talked about the case with. I'm shocked. I don't understand. This is why I'm talking about the case. I don't understand. Separately, I, not a lawyer, I understood what the question was leading to. It was just setting up the background so the jury understood the background for the case. So if I understood it, why didn't she, a Yale Law School grad? Anyway, let's continue. Michelle Page specifically didn't answer any questions directly or clearly, but went off on tangents quite often. I think as a lawyer, you should know that you're supposed to give yes or no answers to yes or no questions. Like, even I know that just watching, like, Judge Judy. And even if I didn't know that, I certainly would have figured it out if both lawyers, including my husband, and the judge had corrected me multiple times. I'm not saying it's intentional or unintentional, I just think it's odd. So here's an example from her deposition. So I'm going to read from the transcript and try to give you a little bit of background since we're starting in the middle. They're trying to figure out whether Duzik worked for DiFi or worked for Dragon Curve. So the lawyer asks, "You said he started somewhere. Where did he start?" He being Ryan Duzik. Michelle Page answers, "So Ethan told me that Ryan Duzik's father, David Duzik, we were looking to get people to help us raise money to buy ISS, which we would then put into Dragon Curve. And Ethan told me that he met David Duzik and that David Duzik was, somebody who could help us raise money. He's the head of investment banking at JP Morgan, and he said that he would be able to raise us money, but that he wanted us to hire Ryan, his son. And Ryan, so we would hire that I said we don't have any money in the budget to hire Ryan." And Ethan said, "Yeah, I know. I know that, and I told that to David, and David said that he wanted him to be hired with the title of somebody who had just graduated from business school. But I said, but he hadn't graduated from business school, that he only had a college degree. And he said, yes, I understand, but that's what his father wanted him to be hired with, a title that he was going to be like a vice president of some sort, and that he had gone to business school, and that he would have a salary that was commensurate with graduating from business school. And I think he said something like his father wanted it to be around $130,000. At which point I just said, well, even if we did have the budget, that doesn't make any sense since our CTO is only getting $120,000 and our senior vice president, who has years of experience, is only getting $100,000. And we have a number of tech people that are only getting $100,000, really important tech people that are only getting $100,000. And he said, I understand, but that's what his father wants him to do, wants him to get. And I reiterated that we didn't have any money in the budget for that. And even if we did, we couldn't do that price. And he said, well, I told him it would be contingent upon us getting the IIS deal. And he said to me that, David said that he can really get us the capital for that. And that would be very helpful. And so that was the contingent deal. So then the lawyer asked the question, so did either DiFi or Dragon Curve hire Ryan Duzik? And she answers, So Dragon Curve never hired anybody. There was nobody hired at Dragon Curve because Dragon Curve would only have anybody. And then the lawyer interrupts and says, "Could you answer my question?" And she says, "Yes, I answered the question." And the lawyer says, "I think you're going into a different issue. I'm trying to figure out who, if anyone, between DiFi and Dragon Curve hired Ryan Duzick." And she answers, before the deal closed, because I was totally willing to let it be until the deal closed, we would hire him. But his father said he wanted him to also have medical insurance because he was clumsy, his son. He's injury prone. So we put him on full commission, sales commission, in digital finance. And it was supposed to be temporary until we got the deal, and transferred him to Dragon Curve, when the deal would be completed for IIS. And then the lawyer asks, "So if I'm following your testimony, it's that Ryan Duzick was hired as an employee at Digital Financial Group, correct?" And she answers, "A temporary, yeah." So then they go on to discuss what temporary means. I don't think we need to hear anymore. This goes into what I'm saying. The answer should have been Duzick was hired at DiFi as a temporary employee. So I don't understand how it took this long to get to that answer. There's another section I'd like to read. It's a little bit shorter. So the lawyer asks, "And what was Mr. Duzick's role with Digital Financial?" And she answered, "Well, that was the thing. He didn't really have a role. So the role was more for him to, from what I understood from what Ethan told me, that his father told Ethan, was that his father did not want him in the marijuana industry. His son, Ryan, wanted," and then the lawyer interrupts, Excuse me, I'm not asking you about this. I'm asking you about what Mr. Duzick, what Ryan Duzick's role was with DiFi, not," and she interrupts, "So that's what I'm trying to say, what the role was. I'm trying to say what the role was." So then the defense's lawyer interrupts, and this is not Christopher Page, this is a previous lawyer that they had hired, and he says, "If you let her answer, she'll give you the answer." And then the plaintiff's lawyer, who had been questioning her, says, "Well, that hasn't been the recent history, but go ahead, please." So she answers, "So his father wanted him not to be in the marijuana industry. He wanted to do warehousing. And so what I understood is what he wanted to do was get into fintech, and he wanted him to learn about fintech. And he said that was his investing in his son to learn about fintech. And he wanted us to divert his attentions away from that. And so because he was working with his father, hopefully to raise his capital for this IIS acquisition, and was doing due diligence, I thought he was learning. What he was doing was learning about what we were doing so that he can make a meaningful contribution in some sort of manner, whether that was raising money with his father, or if it wasn't raising money with his father, it was going and making sales to his father's network of our services." And just to drop in here some more background, the IIS is the King's acquisition. This is the deal that fell through, started this whole mess. So anyway, once again, I don't know what to make of this. So there was another notable event during the trial. There was a lot of hullabaloo about including David Duzick's deposition as evidence. So this is Ryan Duzick's father. The defense wanted to present it, and the plaintiff did not. And the judge ruled that it should not be presented. However, there were many sidebars and objections where the defense attempted to bring it up, regardless of the judge's ruling that it can't be brought up. So this came up when Michelle Page was testifying and attempting to answer why Ryan Duzick was hired under these strange circumstances. She attempted to talk about Ryan's father, David Duzick, and was told not to. The attorneys and the judge had a sidebar discussing it, and she again was told not to talk about it. She then complained that she can't truthfully answer the question without talking about David Duzick. She then argued with the judge, speaking over her, and continued talking about him during that question and later questions, to the point that she referred to him as he who must not be named on multiple occasions. Now I, even with minimal knowledge of the law, know that you gotta follow the judge's rules. The judge is the judge. They make the rules. And you certainly don't yell over a judge when they're telling you to stop talking about something. And that is double, triple, quadruple true when you yourself just said that you were a big supporter of women and minorities, which the judge just so happened to be both. So whether it's intentional or a lack of understanding of court etiquette, or she just couldn't control herself, it's not a good look, in my opinion. It's not a good look. So anyway, let's move on to Chapter 8, Unanswered Questions. So the first question I have coming out of this is, who actually owns Dragon Curve? Let's look at what everyone says. In a memo from the defense written by Christopher Page, he says, quote, "My wife's decision to create Dragon Curve in July 2019, unquote." He also says, quote, "the company that my wife would create in July." So he's saying that at very least Michelle Page created Dragon Curve. There's also an email from Christopher Page to the plaintiff's attorney that says that Dragon Curve has two shareholders, Michelle Page and Ethan Eden. There is a contradiction during Ethan Eden's deposition, however. He says that he, Eden, conceptualized the idea and brought in Michelle Page and maybe another person he couldn't remember. And then later in the same deposition, he said he thinks it's owned by Michelle Page and himself, but, quote, "you would probably want to ask her to get the specifics on that," unquote. Guys, this company is being sued. They're in the middle of a lawsuit. Wouldn't it be super important to know if your name is on the paperwork for this company that's being sued? Wouldn't you go just check? Take a glance? Why are you punting it off to somebody else? Michelle Page, in her deposition, says that Dragon Curve is, quote, "a shell company that I'm on, I think," unquote. And once again, you are being sued. Why don't you know this? How do you not know what companies you own? What companies you're on? I don't understand. So maybe part of it is the idea of like owner versus shareholder versus CEO versus CFO. Maybe that's why some of the contradiction is here. I don't know. I don't know the technicalities of exactly what they're asking and exactly who's liable if a business goes downhill. But what I did do was look up the business filing for Dragon Curve to see if it had any other information. And let me tell you, this was a task because their business filing is in Nevada, which nothing else I've come across in this case or in these cases had anything on the West Coast, much less Nevada. According to the Nevada Business Entity website, the registered agent for Dragon Curve is resigned, but the officer information says the president, treasurer, and director is Michelle Page. Also listed as a director is Ethan Eden. And then, out of nowhere, the secretary is listed as Christopher Page. So I take this to mean that Michelle Page and Ethan Eden are co-owners, but who knows, man. But at least we have some kind of answer there. My next question is, who are the owners of DiFi? So according to Ethan Eden's deposition, the owners are Michelle Page, himself, Ethan Eden, another person, and then, quote, "smaller investments by private investors that are kind of friends and family of mine," unquote. During Michelle Page's deposition, she says that she is the CFO of DiFi. And that's all I see from the deposition and testimony about who owns DiFi. So in conclusion, I can't find anything else about the company. So anyway, the jury is still out on that one, if you'll excuse the pun. There are other questions that I have. Questions like, how are Dragon Curve and DiFi related? Why are there so many companies? Why didn't Ethan Eden appear at the trial? Why are they suing a company with no money? But instead of going down those rabbit holes, I've been looking into a different rabbit hole. And this is a bombshell reveal that was dropped by the plaintiff's lawyer in the final moments of defense questioning. Chapter 9, the tip of the iceberg. So in the last leg of questioning, the plaintiff's lawyer said that there were two other cases that the Pages were part of, and both involved accusations of sexism. In one of these, Michelle Page was the plaintiff, and she was alleging that she worked for a company unpaid, while others, presumably men, were being paid for doing similar work. It was a little bit more unclear what the other case was about, but in the end, she alleged that the New York court system as a whole was sexist and homophobic. That's my interpretation of it. The plaintiff's lawyer asked her if she remembered accusing them of calling her a C word and her husband an F slur. Now, when the lawyer asked the question, he spelled out the words C-U-N-T and F-A-G-G-O-T. Michelle Page, however, was not as considerate of courtroom sensitivities. She replied that, yeah, she remembered when they called her a and her husband a and she used the full words. I've bleeped them here so I don't get in trouble on the podcast, but she said the full words out loud in the courtroom. And then when the lawyers and the judge tried to tell her to stop, she continued complaining about the court system, and she continued saying the full slurs out loud multiple times. Which, yeah, don't do that. Don't do that in court. Certainly don't do it multiple times. Certainly don't do it after a judge told you to stop. And especially not when you're trying to gain the jury's sympathy. And don't do it after you've said you're a big supporter of women and minorities. Don't go and use language that's offensive specifically to women and minorities. But anyway, those trials are tales for another episode. For now, I'll leave you with the wise words of David Duzik when asked about his son's contract. Quote, I wouldn't have ever advised him to take a job that was contingent on some Whack-a-Doodle event where he wasn't getting paid. Whack-a-Doodle indeed. Stay out of trouble, guys. Don't work without a contract, and always save your contract locally. Until next time. Next time on Whack-a-Doodle, a detour into the gutter. We are fully prepared to litigate this matter until the bitter end. I've read the communications and can best describe them as repulsive and strikingly devoid of wit. You cannot win because you will spend more money litigating than we're fighting over. The views expressed in this podcast are solely those of the host. The podcast is intended for general information and entertainment purposes only. The content provided is based on publicly available records. The podcast, host, and creators make no accusations, implications, or charges of any crime, wrongdoing, or unethical behavior whatsoever. The host has little to no knowledge of justice system norms, and any opinions stated are for the purposes of humor only. Please do not contact anyone mentioned in the podcast.